Hey there, and welcome back to the Deep Dive.
Hello.
Today, we're doing just that, really getting into a single source you shared with us. It's a speech by California Governor Gavin Newsom.
That's right.
And our mission, well, it's pretty straightforward. We're going to unpack this speech, pull out the main claims, look at the specific events the governor talks about, his observations, and the arguments he's making. Crucially, we're sticking only to what this source says, just presenting its perspective. No outside info, no taking sides.
Exactly. And this speech, it really gives you a look into the governor's view on some recent federal actions in Los Angeles. It covers immigration raids and then the federal response to the protests that followed.
Right.
So as you listen, just remember this is one specific viewpoint on what were clearly complex events.
Got it. Okay, let's jump right in. Starting with how the source, the speech, describes those initial federal actions.
Okay.
The governor starts off talking about these large-scale workplace raids, federal agents in and around L.A., apparently over one specific weekend.
Right. And a key point he makes right away is that he sees these as, well, fundamentally different from how things were done before.
Different how?
Well, he really paints a stark contrast. The governor claims the old way, which he says, both parties supported, was about focusing on undocumented folks with serious criminal records or those with final deportation orders.
Okay.
But this administration, he alleges in the speech, is pushing for mass deportations. His words were indiscriminately targeting hardworking immigrant families regardless of their roots or risk.
So a much broader scope, according to him.
Exactly. He explicitly calls it very different than anything we've seen before.
And the speech gives examples, right? Specific ones.
Oh, yeah. He describes federal agents jumping out of unmarked vans near a Home Depot parking lot, just grabbing people.
Wow.
He alleges this was deliberate, targeting a heavily Latino suburb. And he mentions something similar downtown at a clothing company raid.
And the human impact. Does he talk about that?
Definitely. He highlights what he sees as the human cost. In the speech, he claims a U.S. citizen, 9 months pregnant, was arrested.
Really?
That's the claim. And that a 4-year-old girl was taken, family split up. He uses the phrase that friends were quite literally disappearing.
So that's how he frames the sort of immediate consequences of these actions he's describing.
Precisely. The personal impact.
Okay, so according to the speech, what happens next? How did people in L.A. respond?
Well, the governor says every day Angelenos came out. They were exercising their constitutional right to free speech and assembly, protesting what the government was doing.
Standard protest response.
Right. And he also talks about the state and local response. California, L.A. City, L.A. County. They sent police, he says, to help keep the peace.
And how did that go, according to him?
He claims that with some exceptions, they were successful. He sort of uses this to say, look, California knows how to handle unrest. We deal with this. We have our own law enforcement for it.
Okay, makes sense. But then he says things changed.
That's the turning point in his narrative, the federal response to the protests. That's where he claims things escalated.
How so?
He claims what followed involved use of tear gas, flashbang grenades, rubber bullets.
Okay.
And that federal agents were detaining people and, his words, undermining their due process rights.
So a very different type of response than the local one he described.
That's the picture he paints, yes. And then there's a really central claim about the National Guard.
Ah, yes. What does he say there?
The governor states, quite directly, that Donald Trump commandeered 2,000 of our state's National Guard members. And crucially, he says this was done without consulting California law enforcement leaders.
Commandeered.
Yeah.
Without consultation.
That's the claim. He calls the action illegally and for no reason, and he asserts it just inflamed a combustible situation, put people at risk, civilians, officers, even the Guard members themselves, according to the speech.
And he suggests this wasn't accidental?
He argues it was done on purpose, and that this action led to more escalation. According to the governor, as news about the Guard spread, anxiety grew across L.A., people worried about family, friends, and the protests, which he claims were actually winding down and localized because of local police and peaceful protesters.
They started up again?
They started again, and even though he says things were de-escalating locally, the governor claims Trump again chose escalation, chose more force and theatrics over public safety.
So what was the next step in this escalation he describes?
Well, he says Trump then federalized another 2,000 Guard members.
Another 2,000.
Yes, and deployed more than 700 active U.S. Marines.
U.S. Marines.
Wow. And he makes a very specific point about the Marines here. He says they're trained for foreign combat, not domestic law enforcement.
Right, that's a common distinction.
And he's very clear on his stance. He says, and this is a direct quote from the speech, "We do not want our streets militarized by our own armed forces, not in LA, not in California, not anywhere."
Strong words. And what does he say was the result of this military presence?
He paints a pretty grim picture, talks about seeing unmarked cars in school parking lots,
Okay.
about kids afraid of attending their own graduation. He claims Trump was pulling, his phrase was a military dragnet, going way beyond the stated reasons.
A dragnet. Arresting who?
He describes the people being arrested as dishwashers, gardeners, day laborers, and seamstresses,
Yeah.
basically ordinary working people, not the instigators of violence.
How does he interpret all this? What's his take on why this happened?
He offers a pretty sharp interpretation. He calls it weakness masquerading as strength.
Mm-hmm.
And then he makes this really striking claim. Donald Trump's government isn't protecting our communities, they're traumatizing our communities. And that seems to be the entire point.
Wow, that's quite a statement. That's presented as the core critique.
It really seems to be. That the trauma was the objective, according to his perspective in this speech.
Okay. Does the speech mention any official response from California, like legally?
It does. The governor says that just the day before he gave the speech, California filed a legal challenge. They were seeking an emergency court order.
A challenge against what, specifically?
He clarifies that. According to him, they're challenging Trump's reckless deployment of American troops to a major American city.
Okay.
And the goal of the court action, he says, is to stop the use of the American military to engage in law enforcement activities across Los Angeles. So it frames that specific legal conflict.
Got it. And then from there, I understand the speech kind of broadens out to wider warnings.
It really does. He uses this idea saying, if some of us could be snatched off the streets without a warrant based only on suspicion or skin color, then none of us are safe.
That's a powerful line.
It is. And he draws a comparison to authoritarian regimes, claiming they always begin by targeting people who are least able to defend themselves, but they do not stop there.
So he's connecting the LA events to a bigger pattern.
Exactly. He lists a whole range of other actions he claims make up a unified assault on American traditions.
Like what?
Well, the speech mentions firing government watchdogs, declaring a war on culture, on history, on science, on knowledge itself.
Okay.
He alleges databases are quite literally vanishing, talks about delegitimizing news organizations, assaulting the First Amendment, threatening funding.
It's a long list.
It keeps going, dictating university teaching, targeting law firms, the judicial branch, calling for a governor's arrest, presumably his own, and using the military for a vulgar display to celebrate his birthday.
So he's really weaving the specific LA situation into this much broader critique of the administration's actions across the board.
That's clearly the intent presented in the speech, yes.
And he emphasizes this isn't just about California.
Very clearly. He points out that the initial order to commandeer the National Guard applied to every state in this nation.
Ah, okay.
And he says, again, quoting his perspective, this is about all of us. This is about you. California may be first, but it clearly will not end here. Other states are next democracy is under assault before our eyes.
So framing it as a national issue, a threat to democracy itself?
Absolutely. That's the core message he's trying to land there.
And what does he say about checks and balances in all this?
He gives a pretty stark assessment. He claims these actions are like a wrecking ball, hitting the founder's idea of three co-equal branches of independent government.
A wrecking ball.
Yes. He asserts that, in his view, there are no longer any checks and balances. And he specifically calls out Congress, says it's nowhere to be found, and that Speaker Johnson has completely abdicated that responsibility.
Strong criticism of Congress, too, then.
Very direct. And he wraps up that thought with another powerful line. The rule of law has increasingly been given way to the rule of dawn.
Okay. So as the speech winds down, where does he take it? Is there a call to action?
Yes, he shifts towards that. He brings up a quote from Justice Brandeis, saying Brandeis said it best, "In a democracy, the most important office is office of citizen."
The office of citizen.
And from that, he builds his call to action. He says, at this moment, we all need to stand up and be held to account, a higher level of accountability. Stand up.
Yeah.
And does he say anything specific about the protests?
He does. He makes a specific plea. If people are exercising their First Amendment rights, protesting, he says, please please do it peacefully.
Right.
And he acknowledges the feeling out there, the deep anxiety, stress, and fear he says many people are feeling because of the events he's laid out.
So acknowledging the emotion.
Yes, and he tries to turn that into a kind of motivational message. He tells the audience, you are the antidote to that fear and that anxiety.
The antidote.
And he claims that what Donald Trump wants most is your fealty, your silence, to be complicit in this moment, urging people not to be silent or complicit.
Okay. And does he mention anything about consequences for, non-peaceful actions during the protests?
He does briefly circle back to that near the end, just noting the facts as he presents them. Over 220 arrests for law-breaking, violence, destruction. Says tapes are being reviewed for more cases.
But he still emphasizes the majority were peaceful. Yes, he reiterates his earlier point that the majority of Angelenos who protested peacefully, so acknowledges both sides of that.
Okay, so quite a speech.
Indeed.
So there you have it. That was our deep dive, sticking strictly to this one source, this speech from Governor Newsom. We've unpacked his specific claims, the sequence of events as he described them, and the pretty broad arguments he made about federal actions in L.A. and, well, what he sees as the much bigger picture.
Yeah, and it's interesting how the source connects these very specific local events, the raids, the protests, the guard deployment in L.A., to these really fundamental questions, questions about federal power, the military's role inside the country, constitutional rights.
And the health of democracy itself.
Exactly, and he argues, as we heard, that these issues, raised first in L.A., according to him, affect all of us. So Mabel, final thought for you, listening to this breakdown of the source. How does the governor's argument, his claim that democracy is under assault in this specific context he described, how does that challenge or maybe reinforce your own ideas about how democratic institutions are supposed to work, especially during times of civil unrest?
Something to definitely think about. Thanks for bringing this source to us and for joining this deep dive.
My pleasure.